Good morning. I'm delighted absolutely to be here in Hugh Lane Gallery to have an opportunity to talk about some debatable depictions of Arthur Griffith. Any of you who've had the opportunity to drop into the wonderful exhibition of the Lavery portraits that's on at the moment in Collins Barracks will have some inkling of some of what I'm going to be talking about. And the first thing I'm going to be talking about is this lady, Maud Gonne, the redoubtable Maud Gonne, by whom both Arthur Griffith and W.B. Yeats were besotted, and with at least one of whom she probably slept. She characterised a divergence in the native Irish cultural movement as that between art for art's sake or art for propaganda. Yeats ultimately tended towards the former, art for art's sake, and Arthur Griffith more immediately towards a kind of agitprop. For Yeats was an ambitious poet, and Griffith a politically ambitious man, politically ambitious for Ireland. Both Griffith and Yeats had once supported together the cause of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, campaigning before 1900, for example, against the Boer War being waged by Britain in South Africa. The two men also opposed the excavation of the historic Hill of Tara by an idiosyncratic British group of amateurs. Now, Griffith, in his weekly advanced nationalist newspapers, greatly boosted the career and reputation of Yeats, particularly in the United Irishman. And I've outlined this in detail in my biography of Griffith, but they've subsequently clashed. In late 1904, Yeats had what he described as his first serious quarrel with Arthur Griffith. This was when some readers thought that Griffith's United Irishman had implied on the 17th of December that Hugh Lane acted partly out of self-interest in offering paintings to Ireland. A week after that piece appeared, Griffith published a retraction of sorts, somewhat sarcastic. On the 24th of December, 1904, his paper stated, "We're assured the inference which might be drawn from a fact we referred to last week, that Mr. Hugh Lane is a professional picture dealer, would do Mr. Lane injustice, although, of course, there's nothing discreditable in the fact itself. Mr. Lane, we are assured, has gathered the present collection solely with the object of advancing art in Ireland, and his efforts in that direction, instead of benefiting, have involved him in heavy pecuniary loss. We've been invited to verify the assurance by examining his accounts. It's quite unnecessary. The word of a gentleman is sufficient in such a matter. We trust the allegation of the other side, that the academicians look at Mr. Lane's exhibition with jealous eyes for the unworthy reason that they apprehend it may, by affording an education in art to the people, interfere with the sale of their pictures, will also prove to be the result of a misapprehension." Now, incidentally, as you can see here in the slide on the screen, right under that paragraph came another in which Griffith's United Irishman praised the work of Dunedin Industries, established 2 years earlier. In that particular enterprise, Yeats' sister Elizabeth played a leading role, and Yeats himself was somewhat involved. Now, Griffith and Yeats also clashed over John Millington Synge's work, becoming disaffected acquaintances who for years were not on speaking terms. But Griffith's attitude towards Synge was not simply moralistic, as is sometimes thought. Griffith gave a platform in his papers to many intelligent writers, and James Joyce at times was among his admirers. One needs to be sceptical when Griffith's issues with Synge's Playboy of the Western world are dismissed as crudely reactionary. Over a decade later, in January 1916, Griffith attacked Yeats as both an imperialist and imperious, and queried his knowledge and scholarship. But later, as president of the new Dáil, Griffith nominated Yeats to represent Ireland at a convention in Paris concerning the Irish race, and Yeats admitted that he'd be tempted to accept a possible offer to become Minister for Fine Arts in Griffith's government. A friend of Griffith thought that Griffith loved Yeats, it was just a quarrel. And Griffith, when interned in Gloucester Jail in 1918, had organised a celebration of Yeats's birthday with recitations of Yeats's poetry. To use a word such as malevolent to describe Griffith's later attitude to Yeats, as Roy Foster does, is to fix it too solidly. In any event, was Yeats's attitude any less malevolent, not least when at the height of his fame he defined Griffith posthumously as hysterical, as we'll shortly see. The writer Seumas MacManus was puzzled later when Yeats, in his autobiographical writings, didn't make anything of his earlier connections with Griffith. MacManus said, "I wrote to tell him my surprise. He answered that he didn't know him well. This again surprised me, and I told Yeats that I walked into the shabby 2x4 office in which poor Griffith immersed himself in dirty Fownes Street, and saw him, Yeats, sitting on the floor, back resting against the wall, nursing his knees, conversing with Arthur in this most emphatically intimate manner." Yeats didn't reply. However, although not highlighting his debt to Griffith as an editor who had supported and praised him, Yeats did speak generously of Griffith in the Senate after Griffith had collapsed and died in August 1922. Nevertheless, in the late 1930s, Yeats included Griffith rather unpleasantly in a poem that celebrated the Municipal Gallery Revisited. The gallery, where my friends' portraits hang, as Yeats then wrote, had opened recently in the old Parliament House on Parnell Square. Yeats's well-known poem begins, "Around me, the images of 30 years, an ambush, pilgrims at the waterside, casement upon trial, half hidden by the bars, guarded," all of which portraits incidentally seem to be Lavery paintings to which he was referring. Yeats continues, "Griffith staring in hysterical pride." The use of the adjective hysterical here is unexplained, yet it's had a long afterlife in relation to Griffith and has been quite influential, I believe, in forming an opinion about Griffith. This is the portrait by the London-based Irish painter John Lavery to which Yeats referred, and it's in the exhibition at the moment in Collins's Barracks. It was painted during treaty negotiations in London. Griffith sat for it when he went over first with De Valera for the latter's talks with Lloyd George in July 1921, just after the truce was declared. There is no clear representation of hysterical pride in the portrait, nor is there any reason to think that Lavery saw Griffith that way. Indeed, the posture and expression of the sitter appeared to me to be quite subdued. In July 1921, Griffith was only a few weeks out of jail, and he hadn't been very well. And it's not known if he even sat again after that for Lavery. Is it any more hysterical than the gaze of these other treaty delegates and of Lloyd George himself that Lavery then painted and that are in the exhibition that we've mentioned? And then there's Lavery's remarkable portrait of Dail, begun in July 1921 and exhibited in the parish salon that year, also in the exhibition. What's one to make of the unusual choice here of a half-length profile? The profile is somewhat redolent of Patrick Pearse's well-known pose. A French critic thought this was intellectual sorrow personified, or that Dail was like a great mathematician puzzling over perpetual motion. The Westminster Gazette saw in this portrayal a young missionary priest. Yeats's use of the epithet hysterical about Griffith was a subjective judgment, or even a projection presumably based on Yeats's own ostensibly gendered theory that Ireland had for generation pursued fixed ideas until, quote, "At last a generation is like an hysterical woman who will make unmeasured accusations and believe impossible things because of some logical deduction from a solitary thought which has turned a portion of her mind to stone," end quote. Now, if it is the case, as Susan Harris writes, that Yeats articulated a conception of gender that subverts a nationalism that requires its adherents to believe impossible things, it's also the case that Griffith spent much of his life grounding his nationalist objectives within the realms of possibility. His thing of an independent Irish state turned out to be not at all impossible. And as early as 1903 in Griffith's United Irishmen, the socialist Fred Ryan took issue with Yeats for depicting nationalist fervour in a way that Ryan saw as attempting to define advanced nationalists clinically and thus reduce patriotism to pathology. When Yeats later recalled his visit to the Dublin Gallery in Parnell Square and the poem that he wrote about it, he passed over that sideswipe at Griffith. He simply said that the poem in general dealt with his many friends, including statesmen in Ireland in the glory of her passions, as he put it. Foster thinks that the friends invoked in the poem certainly didn't include Griffith. But that assumption may certainly be misplaced, I think, given that Griffith had once been the poet's booster, as demonstrated above briefly and in my biography of him, of Griffith. Yeats himself, indeed, was not immune from pride, as evidenced by lines of that same poem, which articulate the outlook of a cultural elite that ostensibly scorned the middle class upon whom it relied for its income, and Yeats's Abbey Theatre did too. Yeats wrote, "John Synge and I and Augusta Gregory thought all that we did, all that we said or sang, must come from contact with the soil. From that contact, everything, Antaeus like, grew strong. We three alone in modern times had brought everything down to that soul test again. Dream of the noble and the beggar man." I'm not sure what contact with the soil himself and Lady Gregory had, but his romantic idea of the noble and the beggarman or peasant was some distance from Sinn Féin's concept of Ireland when that party won a resounding victory on a substantially expanded democratic franchise in 1918. Griffith sustained efforts to create a national debate by giving Yeats and other intellectuals a platform in the United Irishman. Doesn't seem to have earned the artisan's son a right to be considered cultured. For already in 1909, Yeats had told Lady Gregory that in using the phrase "culture is the sanctity of the intellect," when writing of those who hated the Playboy, he was thinking of people like Arthur Griffith and, quote, "how they can renounce external things without it, but not envy, revenge, jealousy, and so on." He continued, quote, "I compare Griffith and his like to the eunuchs in Rickett's picture watching Don Juan riding through hell." Well, the analogy was inaccurate. Ricketts, the artist himself, pointed out to Yeats that, in fact, those in the painting who watched Don Juan riding through hell are not eunuchs, but older women. I can't help myself wondering if Yeats's confusion of women with eunuchs and his comparison of playwrights such as Synge and ostensibly himself to Don Juan is perhaps worthy of its own psychosexual analysis. And besides, amongst those who disliked Playboy was not just Griffith, but that old woman, Lady Gregory herself, although she didn't stop her Abbey Theatre staging it. What possessed Yeats to damn Griffith as hysterical in Lavery's painting? Griffith was dead over a decade and couldn't defend or cultivate his reputation, as De Valera so assiduously did. De Valera was firmly in power when Yeats wrote this poem. Griffith's reputation was gradually trashed after his death, right up to the present. For example, because of some early and relatively rare pieces in Griffith's weekly newspapers, by no means all of them written by himself, Griffith has been made the scapegoat for Irish anti-Semitism. As late as 1909, he published this cartoon here shown with stereotypical anti-Semitic tropes. But, as I've noted in a number of academic articles on this theme, scathing critics have frequently ignored later articles and statements by Griffith himself that indicate a personal maturing and an assertion of the right of Jews, while some also turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism elsewhere in Irish society before and after Griffith's death. There is, for example, a cartoon shown here in James Larkin's Worker, Irish Worker in 1911, that's similar to that in Griffith's Sinn Féin paper just 2 years earlier. And speaking of Larkin, Griffith has also on occasion been cast as a foe of the working class, largely because he didn't warm to Larkin during the period that Larkin was in Ireland, and he opposed some of his policies because he thought they would be damaging to the poor. But the socialist James Connolly protested alongside Griffith and called him his friend, while the socialist Fred Wine had a platform in Griffith's United Irishman. Griffith himself was no socialist, but his papers are full of journalism aimed at improving the conditions of the poor. And it should be noted that only a small minority of the Irish population has ever regarded socialist parties as representative of their views. Griffith has also been cast as a pacifist, not so much in a complimentary way, but to distance him from the glorious heroes of 1916 and the War of Independence. Some have found Griffith's thoughtful constitutionalist approach a threat to their ambitions. He was not, in fact, a pacifist, but he'd been taught by his mentor, the old Fenian John O'Leary, to eschew violent stunts that might ultimately hurt the poor more than anyone. Griffith had long lived in central Dublin, among some of the poorest people in Europe. This old photo here in the National Library of Ireland shows Griffith with his rifle that he got at Howth on the day of the gun running in 1914. Hardly the ideal pacifist. In the drill beside him, on his right, but our left in the photo, as you can see here, the young man appears to be Pádraig Colum, who was present that day and said later it was the last day he saw Griffith. Colum's career as a poet and playwright was another one boosted by Griffith. Griffith was also invited to a very important meeting called by some members of the IRB Supreme Council in 1914 to plot their strategy during World War I. Present at the meeting were Sean Teo Kelly, Patrick Pearse, Tom Clark, Sean McDermott, Joseph Plunkett, Thomas MacDonagh, John McBride, Arthur Griffith, the Labour activists William O'Brien and James Connolly, and possibly Eamon Kent and Sean Tobin. Most of these men were to sign the 1916 proclamation and be executed as leaders of the rising. Griffith was not, in fact, kept fully informed of plans for the rising in 1916 and was said to be quite sore and vexed about being kept in the dark about the final decision to proceed. But its leaders valued him more as a propagandist for independence than as a volunteer and wanted him to survive. And in any event, his age and eyesight would have made him a poor volunteer. Interned after the 1916 rising in Reading Jail, Griffith's mind turned to the current British threat to introduce conscription in Ireland, and he wrote to his friend Lily Williams, the artist, that England can never enforce conscription if Ireland fights, and Ireland must fight conscription with tongues, pens, sticks, stones, pitchforks, guns, and all the resources of civilization. This was a declaration that again demonstrated that he was not opposed to the use of physical force per se when he thought that it was justified or necessary. And it was also the identification of an issue that was to be crucial in delivering to the Sinn Féin movement its stunning victory in the general election of 1918. And it's too easy to ignore the fact that Sinn Féin swept to victory that year as much because of its resistance to conscription as anything else. So here's Griffith's portrait painted by his friend Lily Williams, and some correspondence between them survives when much of Griffith's papers have been lost. It's in the Hugh Lane Gallery too, but not in the current exhibition. It was used later in a collection of his ballads published not long after Griffith's death. Griffith loved to collect and sing songs. There's even a photograph of Lily Williams with that portrait that survives in the National Library of Ireland, although, as you can see here, it's sadly faded. It's sometimes forgotten that Griffith acted as president substitute of the revolutionary Dáil Éireann when Valera went to America during most of the War of Independence in 1919 and 1920. In that capacity, he sanctioned military actions, as well as overseeing the establishment of mechanisms of government, which is sometimes forgotten was a considerable achievement. In fact, even before De Valera resigned as president, when the Dáil approved the treaty in 1922, and when Griffith then formally replaced him, Griffith had already, in a substitute capacity, served as Dáil president longer than De Valera himself did. And Griffith was interned without trial on and off for a longer total of time before 1922 than were De Valera and most of the other leading Republicans. He's a person who hasn't received as much attention as his role then merited. Yet compared to as being painted in ink as a scapegoat for anti-Semitism and as an uncultured petty bourgeois in relation to the playboy and as some kind of pacifist wimp, it's his role as chairman of the Sinn Féin treaty team in London that's given rise to some of the most dubious portraits of the man whom even his anti-treaty opponent Harry Boland reportedly said made us all, and Collins reportedly called the father of us all. It turned out that the awkward real politics of the treaty could be hung around the shoulders of the conveniently dead Griffith. There's too little time here today to deconstruct various myths that grew up around the agreement for a treaty that Griffith and Collins and the others signed in London a century ago tomorrow. But I've done so in two recent books. First, my biography of Griffith, published last year, and now recently in my book Midnight in London, published by Eastwood Books. I'm just going to mention very briefly the main myths here. Firstly, the belief that Collins led the team in London. It's remarkable how often the impression is given in popular accounts on TV or elsewhere, and frequently sometimes by omission, that Collins led the negotiation. He was, of course, a key participant, albeit reluctantly, going only because Dev pressed him into it when Dev wouldn't go himself. But Griffith was chairman, and Collins clearly, in fact, deferred to him. The second great myth is that the treaty somehow partitioned Ireland. In discussions about the treaty, it's commonly asserted that somehow it created the border. But of course, the British had divided Ireland by the Government of Ireland Act 1920, and Northern Ireland's Parliament was already elected and sitting before a truce was agreed in July 1921. And De Valera told the Dáil in August that Ulster counties could vote themselves out of any republic. The third myth is that Griffith made a binding and personal secret commitment to Lloyd George halfway through negotiations in early November 1921. And it's a pernicious myth. Right up to the publication of very recent books, this notion is kept afloat in various and sometimes contradictory ways, and is substantially sustained by a reliance on Frank Pakenham's 1935 volume Peace by Ordeal. The book is misleading and inaccurate in at least one major respect, in my opinion. It has contributed largely to Griffith's response to a certain vital British memo being misconstrued, if not misrepresented. It suggests that this misrepresentation suggests that he somehow assented to the content of that memo, when in fact Griffith explicitly reserved his position on it in relation to Northern Ireland and stated clearly that he couldn't bind his colleagues ahead of further discussions. A fourth found myth is that Griffith's team broke a promise not to accept an oath of allegiance to the king. But the wording of the proposed oath was in fact changed shortly before the agreement signed as part of the final deal, and the proposed oath of allegiance to the king was replaced by an oath of faithfulness. Now you can argue that there was no great difference, and of course some did so. But what one cannot do, unless making a damning point falsely, is to refer to an oath of allegiance to the king as such being in the agreement that was actually signed. It wasn't. The final myth I'm going to mention is that they signed the treaty and thus condemned Ireland to it. Now, while some even of the team itself used that shorthand that they signed the treaty, it's important to bear in mind that the word treaty didn't even appear on the document that they signed 2 hours after midnight on the 6th of December. What they then signed, as you can see here, was actually headed Articles of Agreement. It was just an agreement for a treaty, and it was subject to approval by all members of Dáil Éireann before it could become a binding treaty. This is not just a nice legal point. By portraying Griffith as having somehow signed away ultimate Republican ambitions, his detractors could distract from the fact that the agreement was approved in short order by the Irish Cabinet, Dáil Éireann and the 26 county electorate, and finally ratified by the Dáil. So, we're coming near the end now, but before concluding, may I say that my least favourite image of Griffith is this one, a photograph often used that shows him at a bare desk looking sideways at the camera. It seems awkward and directed by the photographer, and he looks uncomfortable. He may then have been suffering from one of his bouts of ill health that preceded his sudden death in August 1922. But the photo does at least resonate with a little anonymous and undated note that I found among some papers relating to Arthur Griffith in the National Library. The note reads, Arthur Griffith died of a broken heart. Shortly after the start of the Civil War, workmen were delayed in getting into his office as he was seated at his desk with his hands to his face. On arranging his desk for removal, one of the workmen discovered the blotting pad was quite wet with his tears. But as images go, I prefer that which appeared on the cover of a New York Times supplement in January 1922, when Griffith was president of the Dáil. This is an image that I happened on in an old bookstore in the US state of Maine. It shows Griffith confident and in good humour, a man who felt that he'd overcome the personal and political odds to achieve for Ireland objectives that seemed to most people far-fetched when he founded Sinn Féin in 1905. Sadly, of course, within 8 months of that New York Times supplement appearing, Griffith was dead. Now, the Yeats later chose to characterise Griffith's appearance in Lavery's painting as hysterical, when so many other detractors were ready to diminish the dead Griffith's reputation. Seems to me to have been a lapse by the Nobel Prize winner into art as some kind of personal or political propaganda, and to have been an interpretation so subjective that Lavery himself could not have imagined it when he painted Griffith. But why not decide for yourself while there's a chance, while this exhibition is on in Collins Barracks? Go and see the portrait of Griffith and see it sitting there alongside portraits of all 5 Irish delegates and of the 4 main British delegates to the peace talks, as well as other related portraits, that of Dev in July 1921 and the House of Lords approving of the treaty in December 1921, and other related material. It's very interesting. And you be the judge of whether you think Yeats was fair when he made this reference to Griffith, which is one of the things that has made Griffith sometimes a person who is neglected in Irish historiography instead of being to the forefront in our understanding of the foundation of this state. Thank you very much.